An important element of team projects involves giving feedback to peers. Whether it's team projects in the classroom or in a professional setting, peer evaluations are a key way that teams and team members grow and develop. But how do we actually learn how to give feedback to our peers? Hello, I'm Lauren Vicker, here today with Tim Franz to discuss one approach to peer evaluation, which is teaching team members exactly how to do it. Tim, welcome.
Thanks for having me today, Lauren.
Giving feedback to another person is really very tricky, and so many people avoid giving feedback to others. You have a quote here from your colleague Seth Silver. Problem behavior ignored or tolerated is problem behavior encouraged. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact of not giving feedback?
Well, yeah, the impact of not giving feedback can be very serious. But before I do that, given that you just said Seth's name, let me give some credit. The ideas in this whole presentation come from, certainly I've contributed, but Lauren, as you know, you've contributed to the development of these, and so has my friend Seth, and so has my wife, Elizabeth Franz. So, but to get to Seth's quote here, one of the problems, the first one that we see with teams is that if people don't get feedback, they think everything is going all right. And this is a problem in the future because if they think everything's going all right, they will continue to act that way and the undesirable behavior will continue. And we want to stop that undesirable behavior with feedback. Now, a third issue is we want to avoid any surprises. A lot of organizations give annual reviews, and I've seen it in my organizations in the past where somebody is surprised at the end that they got some constructive feedback or developmental feedback, and this shouldn't happen. So ongoing feedback is really important, because if you're not giving that ongoing feedback and people aren't performing the way they should, the other team members lose motivation. And then finally, employees have less trust in the person who has to give the feedback, whether that's a professor or a supervisor, doesn't matter. This says supervisor, but it doesn't really matter because people won't trust the feedback they're getting in general because they're not getting or everybody is not getting the feedback.
So from hearing you talk about feedback, I know that we're going to be talking about three different types: planned feedback, feedback in the moment, and also feedback that explodes.
The reason that we're going to talk about all three is because the process is dramatically different for these three.
So let's talk first about planned feedback, because that sounds like the most constructive way to give feedback.
When possible, planning feedback is really important. And annual performance evaluations are planned feedback moments, but we should be planning feedback moments in regular time frames as well. And when you're giving planned feedback, the first thing is to prepare in advance. And the most important part of preparing in advance is to think through your opening. When you're opening, you can really give some guidelines for what's coming. In this conversation, I'd like to give you some feedback. Is that okay? So plan how you're going to open that conversation. And the next thing is to express your intention, which is to help them improve. You're not giving feedback to make them angry or frustrated. You're trying, especially from our standpoint as professors or supervisors, you want people to develop. You want your students to develop. So expressing your intention to help them is important. Now, positive feedback can be given anytime. And in fact, we need to improve at giving positive feedback. But there are times where we're giving negative feedback or constructive feedback or developmental feedback so that people can get better. Carefully consider your location. So feedback, if it's going to be constructive or critical or negative in any way, should be given privately. And then finally, always end on a positive note with what people can do to improve and focus on that level of improvement. there are a lot of times people talk about the feedback sandwich, and I still hear that. And the evidence shows that the feedback sandwich really doesn't work very well. In fact, the research shows it's a bit of a failure because you give the feedback sandwich, positive, negative, positive. People hear that positive feedback, and then once they hear the negative, they've given up on their original positive feedback. So, but you do want to end with a positive note that's looking forward.
Okay. So the second type of feedback is feedback in the moment, which is obviously different from the planned feedback.
Now, feedback in the moment is when you notice something that somebody could change quickly. And to do this, you want to make it part of the conversation where you say something, hey, I just noticed that. Do you mind if I tell you about? So try to make it something that's an ongoing piece of the conversation when you can. But first, stop and check yourself. If you're stewing, if you're angry, if it's going to come out with a lot of negative emotion, you might want to wait until another time. So carefully consider your timing. Is this the right time? Is it going to be constructive? And should I wait till it's private, or should I wait till I'm not angry? Now, try to do this to create non-events, which means you're just talking, you're just having a conversation, and you're using positive language about what they can do to move forward. And then, as always, make sure you're telling them what they're doing well. As I said before, positive feedback makes a really big difference.
And I think that's a good thing to emphasize, the positive nature of what feedback can be, because I think people, whenever they think about peer feedback, it's always thinking negatively, but emphasizing the positive.
Yeah. What can you do better? Where can you improve? Not where are you doing wrong?
And the third type of feedback, feedback that explodes, that sounds like a really destructive kind of feedback.
Well, there are situations where things go wrong and emotions come out and people have been explosive. It happens. It happens to almost everybody at work. And so the goal in this time is not to give feedback, but to recover. At this point, you want to work to recover. So number one is to apologize. The power of apology cannot be stressed enough. And if you want to know more about how important that is, go watch a video. It's on YouTube by Tom Peters. It's called The Power of Apology. So think about an immediate apology and then explain for why it got explosive. Give a reasonable explanation. Talk about what happened. And then you want to show, as a leader, empathy. So check in to see if they're okay. Make sure that they're doing well, and then let them know at the end of the conversation that you remain approachable and you can move on into positive developmental steps, gain that recovery for the next time you need. So you'll notice these steps are a lot different. It's all about recovery.
So we don't provide feedback that explodes. There is a process that we can use to prepare to give feedback to a fellow student or to a colleague.
Yes, there are really 4 steps to the process when preparing to give feedback. Number one is ask permission. Hey, do you mind if I give you feedback? Or set up a time that is specific to giving that feedback. Number 2, make it private. It's always important, especially if there's going to be developmental or constructive feedback, that it should be given privately. Number 3, check your emotions so that you can remain calm. And number 4, don't wait, especially if it's developmental feedback to try to get somebody to change and improve. You want it as close to the event as possible. You don't want to wait 6 months or a year till the next performance appraisal. You want to give it within a week.
And I think you're really stressing the importance of making feedback ongoing then.
Yes. So feedback should be an ongoing process, not once a year. Good point, Lauren.
So up to this point, we've been talking about giving feedback, but peer evaluation is obviously a two-way street. So what should we keep in mind when we ourselves are receiving feedback?
Well, during this peer evaluation, as you point out, people are giving feedback and we need to teach them how to do that. At the same time, we need to prepare them to receive the feedback, because unless you're going to act on the feedback, nothing will change. So number one is to remind them to be open to feedback. The goal of the feedback is to tell people what they're doing well and what they could do better. And if they know that's coming for everybody ahead of time, that's a start. Number two is we train students to think about the story they're telling themselves. It's really easy, especially when getting developmental feedback, to start to tell yourself a story about the situation. I think about driving down the street. When I'm driving a car down the street and somebody cuts me off, I start telling myself a story. The reason they did this is that, all angry and, calling them names and all those other things. And the reality is maybe they didn't see me. I've been in situations where I've cut somebody off because I haven't seen them. Maybe it's a new driver. I've been teaching my kids to drive and things like that happen. So think about the story and give people the benefit of the doubt that they're there to help you develop. So number 4 is be open to improving, because if you're a supervisor, if you're a college professor, if you're a high school teacher, you are actually in the job of giving feedback and receiving feedback, and you need to be ready to improve based on that feedback.
So Tim, we've covered a lot of information in this relatively short conversation. Can you remind us of some of the highlights, some of the key takeaways from today's conversation?
Well, I'll give you 6 key takeaways. Number 1, and you've heard this several times, praise in public, constructively comment in private. A really important reminder. Number 2, let people assess themselves first, because if we ask them how they're doing or what they think, often people are pretty calibrated, and this can get the conversation off to a good start. Number 3, tell people why you're doing this. My goal is to help you develop. Number 4, don't save the feedback, because the farther you get from events, especially events where you're asking for change, the harder it is to bring that up. Number 5, and you've heard this, focus on the future. Well, when you think about, I'll give another driving analogy. When you're driving down the road, the windshield is big and the rear view mirror is very small. And there's a reason for that, because we want people to look where they're going, not back where they've been. Certainly you need to check back once in a while. And it's a check back. That's an important part. You want to know what's behind you, but more important, you want to go forward, focus on the future. And then finally, that really idea of positive feedback. Never let good work go unnoticed. People crave positive regard. Giving them that feedback that supports them and tells them what they're doing well is so essential, and we don't do it enough.
And I'd like to point out that it's a great skill that we equip our students with to take off into the workplace, and even a good talking point for them when they go on job interviews.
Great point.
So for anyone who wants more information, Tim has several books, single and co-authored, Making Team Projects Work, which is our latest work together, Meaningful Partnerships at Work, which he has done with his friend Seth Silver, and Group Dynamics and Team Interventions, which is a textbook that Tim has solely authored and will be coming out in a second edition later this year. We also invite you to visit the website, teambuildingprocess.com, and there's also an email address if you want to contact Tim and get some more information. So Tim Franz, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this teaching strategy.
Well, thanks for having me. I hope this helps students and employees to do better with how they give peer evaluation.